The door opened with a quiet click, but what he saw inside shattered something far louder than silence. Armin Shaw had returned home hours earlier than expected, his mind still tangled in numbers, deals, and deadlines. Billion-dollar negotiations had never shaken him the way that single moment did. The briefcase slipped from his hand and hit the marble floor with a dull, forgotten thud. His breath stalled, his chest tightened, and his world, carefully built over years, began to crack in ways he had never imagined. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet strength of doing what's right, even when it's hard, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these stories alive. In the center of the living room sat the woman who had raised him, the woman who had given him everything when the world had given her nothing in return. His adoptive mother, Mira, her silver hair falling softly over her face, her wrists trembling slightly as they rested in her lap. She wasn't crying. That was the worst part. Her silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with years of endurance, dignity, and pain that had learned how to stay quiet. But what made his heart pound with a burning rage was what held her in place. A thick rope wound tightly around her torso, binding her to the chair, and across the room, seated calmly as if nothing were wrong, was his wife, Sana. She held a glass of wine in her hand, her posture elegant, her expression unreadable. The golden light from the chandelier reflected off her satin dress, casting a deceptive warmth over a scene that was anything but warm. For a moment, Armin couldn't move. His brain refused to accept what his eyes were telling him. This was his home, his safe place. The place he had built not just with wealth but with memories. And yet, standing there, he felt like a stranger walking into a nightmare. Mira slowly lifted her gaze. Their eyes met. And in that silent exchange, 1,000 unspoken emotions passed between them. She didn't ask for help. She didn't plead. She simply looked at him the way she always had, with love that expected nothing in return. That look broke him. Armin stepped forward, each footstep heavier than the last. His voice, when it came, was low and strained, as though forcing itself through layers of disbelief. He didn't shout. He didn't demand. The shock had numbed him in a way anger couldn't immediately reach. Sana turned her head slowly, her calmness almost unsettling. There was no panic in her eyes, no attempt to hide what she had done. Instead, there was something colder, something calculated, something that made Armin realize this wasn't a moment of madness. It was a choice. And that realization cut deeper than anything else. Years earlier, when Armin had met Sana, he had believed he'd found someone who understood him. Someone who admired his journey, respected his values, and saw beyond his wealth. He had trusted her with his life, his heart, and most importantly, with the one person who mattered more than everything he owned, Mira. Mira, who had found him as a frightened child abandoned outside a railway station. Mira, who had taken him in despite having barely enough to feed herself. Mira, who had worked long days and sleepless nights so he could go to school, so he could dream bigger than their circumstances. She had never been defined by her struggles. She had always been defined by her strength. And now she sat tied up in the house he had built for her, in the presence of the woman he had chosen to share his life with. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Armin's thoughts raced, searching for an explanation that could make sense of the scene before him. But deep down, he already knew. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was betrayal. Sana finally spoke, her voice smooth, almost indifferent. There was no remorse in her tone, no hesitation. It was as if she believed she had done something justified. Armin's hands clenched at his sides. He wasn't just angry. He was hurt in a way that felt personal, deep, and irreversible. He had given Sana everything. Not just luxury, not just comfort, but trust. And she had used that trust to humiliate the one person who had given him life in every way that mattered. Mira shifted slightly in her chair, the rope tightening with the movement. Her face remained composed, but Armin noticed the faint tremor in her hands. She wasn't afraid for herself. He knew that. She was afraid for him, afraid of what this moment would do to him. That realization snapped something inside him. He moved quickly, kneeling beside her, his fingers fumbling with the rope. It was tied tightly, deliberately. Whoever had done this had taken their time. That thought sent another wave of anger through him. As the rope loosened, Mira's shoulders relaxed slightly. She still didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence carried more weight than any words ever could. Armin helped her stand, his hands gentle, almost reverent. This was the woman who had held him when he was broken, who had believed in him when no one else did. And now he was the one who had to be strong for her. Behind him, Sana watched, her expression unchanged. That lack of emotion was what made everything worse. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a moment of weakness, it was a reflection of who she truly was, and Armin realized with a painful clarity that he had been blind. The days that followed were not loud or dramatic. There were no explosive arguments, no public scenes. Instead, there was a quiet unraveling. The kind that happens slowly but leaves nothing untouched. Armin moved Mira into a different home, one filled not just with comfort but with warmth and safety. He made sure she had everything she needed, but more importantly, he made sure she knew she was valued, respected, and loved. As for Sana, the distance between them grew into something unbridgeable. Every glance, every silence, every memory now carried a weight it hadn't before. The trust was gone, and without trust, there was nothing left to hold on to. But the real transformation wasn't in his marriage. It was in Armin himself. For years, he had focused on building an empire. He had chased success, believing it would secure happiness. But this moment forced him to confront a truth he had overlooked. Success meant nothing if it came at the cost of the people who mattered most. He began to change. Not in grand, dramatic ways, but in small, meaningful ones. He spent more time with Mira, listening to her stories, sharing quiet moments that didn't need words. He reconnected with the parts of himself he had neglected, the parts that remembered where he came from and who had helped him get there. And slowly, something began to heal. The pain didn't disappear. It never fully does, but it transformed into something else, something stronger, something that reminded him of what truly mattered. Before we reach the end of this story, take a moment to tell us in the comments, have you ever experienced a moment that changed how you see someone forever? Because some moments don't just reveal the truth, they redefine everything. Armin eventually made a decision that many would find difficult, but for him it was necessary. He chose to walk away from a relationship that had lost its foundation. It wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about self-respect, about protecting the people he loved, and about refusing to accept a reality that didn't align with his values. And in doing so, he found something unexpected: peace. Not the kind that comes from having everything, but the kind that comes from knowing you've done the right thing, even when it hurts. Mira, despite everything, remained the same gentle, resilient woman she had always been. She didn't hold on to bitterness. She didn't dwell on what had happened. Instead, she continued to live with the same quiet strength that had defined her entire life. And in her presence, Armin found a reminder of what true wealth really looked like. Not money, not power, not status, but love, loyalty, and the courage to stand up for what's right. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps spread messages that the world needs more of, messages of kindness, courage, and second chances, because sometimes the most powerful changes don't come from what we gain. They come from what we choose not to tolerate anymore. Armin thought the hardest part was over. He was wrong, because walking away from betrayal is one kind of pain, but living with the truth of it day after day is another kind entirely. The house felt different now, not quieter, not emptier, but heavier. As if the walls themselves had absorbed what had happened and refused to let it fade. In the weeks after Sana left, Armin buried himself in work again, but this time, it wasn't ambition driving him. It was escape. Late nights turned into early mornings. Meetings stretched longer than they needed to. Numbers and contracts became a distraction from something far more difficult to confront: the guilt. Because no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, one question kept returning to him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. How had he not seen it? How had he brought someone into his life, into Mira's life, without truly knowing who she was? That question didn't just hurt, it haunted him. Meanwhile, Mira adjusted in her own quiet way. She never complained, never brought up that day unless Armin did. But there were small changes, subtle, almost invisible to anyone who didn't know her deeply. She locked her door at night now. She startled slightly when footsteps came unexpectedly. And sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she would sit still for long periods, her gaze distant, as if revisiting something she didn't want to remember. Armin noticed all of it, and each small detail felt like a silent accusation, not from her, but from his own conscience. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in soft shades of gold and amber, Armin found Mira sitting in the garden. The air was calm, carrying the faint scent of jasmine. She looked peaceful, but he knew better. He sat beside her, not saying anything at first. Their relationship had never needed many words, but this time, silence felt different. It felt unfinished. Finally, he spoke, not as a billionaire, not as a man used to control and certainty, but as a son. He told her everything he had been holding inside: the guilt, the anger, the regret. The unbearable thought that, in trying to build a perfect life, he had unknowingly allowed harm to come to the one person who had never harmed anyone. His voice wasn't steady. It broke more than once. And when he finished, he didn't look at her. He couldn't. For a long moment, Mira said nothing. Then gently, she placed her hand over his. That simple gesture, warm, familiar, unconditional, undid him completely. When she finally spoke, her words were soft, but they carried a strength that years of hardship had forged. She didn't blame him. She didn't question his choices. Instead, she reminded him of something he had forgotten: that love is not measured by perfection, but by what we do when things fall apart. She told him that what mattered wasn't the mistake, it was what he chose to do after it. And in that moment, something shifted inside Armin. For the first time since that day, he felt something other than pain. He felt clarity. From that day forward, Armin began to rebuild, not his business, not his reputation, but his purpose. He started quietly at first. Donations to shelters, funding programs for elderly care, supporting organizations that protected vulnerable individuals from abuse and neglect. But soon, it wasn't enough to just write checks. He wanted to be involved. He wanted to make sure no one else experienced what Mira had endured. Not in silence, not in their own home, not at the hands of someone they should have been able to trust. Months later, he launched a foundation in Mira's name. It wasn't announced with grand press conferences or flashy headlines. It didn't need to be. Its impact spoke for itself. The foundation focused on something deeply personal: protecting and empowering adoptive parents, especially those from marginalized backgrounds who often faced quiet discrimination and vulnerability. It provided legal support, safe housing, counseling, and most importantly, dignity. Because Armin had learned something the hard way: pain isn't always loud. Sometimes it sits quietly in a room, waiting to be noticed. As the foundation grew, so did Armin's sense of peace. Not because he had erased the past, but because he had transformed it into something meaningful. And through it all, Mira remained at the center of his world. She didn't change. She didn't need to. Her strength had never been about resistance. It had always been about resilience. One afternoon, during a small gathering at the foundation, Armin watched as Mira spoke to a group of women who had gone through hardships of their own. She didn't stand on a stage. She didn't give a formal speech. She simply sat among them, listening, offering quiet encouragement, sharing pieces of her own story. And something beautiful happened. They saw themselves in her, not as victims, but as survivors. Not power, but the lives you touch, the pain you ease, and the hope you restore. Before we come to the final moments of this story, take a second to write something meaningful in the comments. Just one word: respect. If you believe people like Mira deserve more recognition, more protection, and more love in this world. Because sometimes, even a small word can carry a powerful message. Years passed, but that day, the day everything changed, never completely faded. It became a quiet reminder, a turning point that shaped everything that followed. And as time moved forward, something unexpected happened. Armin began to forgive, not because Sana deserved it, but because he deserved peace. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean excusing what had happened. It simply meant releasing the weight of anger that had been holding him back. And, in doing so, he freed himself. One evening, as Armin and Mira sat together watching the sunset, the same way they had countless times before, there was a sense of calm that hadn't existed in a long time. No tension, no unspoken pain, just presence, just gratitude. Armin looked at her, not just as the woman who had raised him, but as the strongest person he had ever known. And he realized something that changed him forever. She had given him everything, not just once, but twice. First, when she chose him as a helpless child. And again, when she chose to forgive him as a grown man. That kind of love couldn't be measured. It could only be honored. If this story touched your heart, if it made you feel something real, take a moment to share, and subscribe. Because stories like these remind us of what truly matters in a world that often forgets. In the end, Armin didn't become a better man because of his success. He became a better man because of his choices. Because when faced with betrayal, he chose integrity. When faced with guilt, he chose accountability. And when faced with pain, he chose to turn it into purpose. And maybe that's the real lesson here, that no matter how broken a moment may seem, it can still become the beginning of something meaningful. All it takes is the courage to choose differently.